Have you ever read something, understood it perfectly, and then a week later, it's gone? Not blurry, not partially remembered, just gone. Like your brain quietly deleted the file. You sit there thinking, I swear I knew this. But when you try to explain it to someone, nothing comes out. And that moment feels strangely personal. Like maybe the problem isn't the information. Maybe the problem is you. Most people never say that out loud, but they think it. They assume their memory is weak, their focus is broken, their brain just isn't built for learning. So they do what frustrated minds always do. They push harder, read more pages, watch more videos, highlight half the book in neon yellow, and somehow, the more they consume, the less they actually remember. Now here's the uncomfortable truth. The problem was never your brain. The problem is that nobody ever taught you how memory actually works. Think about it. School teaches you what to memorize. Tests measure how much you remember, but almost no one teaches you how remembering happens. It's like being handed a car and told to win a race without ever learning how the engine works. So you drive harder, press the gas harder, and when the car stalls, you blame yourself. But this is where things start to change. Because once you understand one simple truth about the brain, everything about learning begins to shift. Your brain is not designed to remember information. That sounds strange, doesn't it? But stay with me. Your brain is designed to filter information. Every second, your senses are flooded with millions of signals, sounds, images, thoughts, tiny details your mind quietly ignores. If your brain tried to store everything, you would collapse under the weight of it. So your mind has a survival system, a ruthless one. It constantly asks one question. Is this important enough to keep? If the answer is no, the information disappears. Not because you're stupid, not because you weren't paying attention, but because your brain decided it wasn't worth storing. And suddenly, something clicks. Maybe forgetting isn't a failure. Maybe it's a feature. Now pause for a second and think about your own life. How many things did you study, only to forget days later? A chapter from a textbook, a podcast episode, something useful you were genuinely interested in, and yet your brain treated it like background noise. Be honest. Does that feel familiar? Most people think memory works like a camera. You look at something, and your brain stores a snapshot. But memory doesn't work like a camera. It works more like a story. Your brain remembers meaning, not information. Let that sink in for a moment. If something feels emotionally important, connected to something you already know, or surprising enough to wake up your attention, your brain marks it. It tags the moment as important, and that tag tells your memory system, keep this. Everything else, discarded. Which means something slightly uncomfortable is also true. If you forgot something you studied, your brain simply didn't see a reason to keep it. And that's not your fault. Because most information today is delivered in the worst possible way for memory. Endless scrolling, fast content, passive consumption. You sit back, your brain stays relaxed, nothing demands effort, which feels easy. But easy is the enemy of memory. Now here's where things get interesting. Because once you realize this, you start seeing learning differently. The goal isn't to consume more information. The goal is to interact with it in a way your brain refuses to ignore. But here's the part nobody tells you. Your brain doesn't reward passive attention. It rewards struggle. Yes, struggle. The small moment when you try to recall something and your mind searches for the answer. That tension, that effort, that tiny mental resistance. That's the moment memory begins forming. Ironically, the moment learning feels hardest is often the moment your brain is learning the most. Strange, right? Now let me ask you something. When you try to remember something, do you immediately check the answer? Or do you sit with the question for a moment and force your brain to reach for it? Most people choose the first option. Instant relief, instant answer. And unknowingly, they sabotage their memory. But wait until you hear what happens when you do the opposite. Because there's a hidden mechanism in the brain, a simple shift in how you approach information that can make things stick in your memory for years instead of days. And once you discover it, learning stops feeling like a losing battle. It starts feeling like control. But before we get there, you have to confront a strange psychological trap almost everyone falls into. A trap that makes smart people feel like they're learning, when they're actually forgetting everything. And once you see it, you'll never read or watch information the same way again.
There's a moment that feels like learning, but actually isn't. And almost everyone falls for it. You're reading a book or watching a video. The ideas make sense. They feel clear, logical, even exciting. You nod your head and think, wow, this is good. And in that moment, you feel productive. Your brain feels busy, active, maybe even a little smarter. But then something strange happens. A few days later, someone asks you about it. Hey, what was that thing you were learning about? And suddenly, your mind goes blank. You remember the feeling of understanding it, but the idea itself? Gone. Now, here's the uncomfortable realization. That feeling of understanding something while you're looking at it is one of the biggest illusions in learning. Psychologists call it the illusion of competence. It's when information looks familiar, so your brain assumes it knows it. But familiarity is not memory. Let me say that again. Just because something looks familiar does not mean your brain can retrieve it later. And memory is not about recognition. Memory is about recall. Think about this for a second. If I show you a multiple choice test, your brain might recognize the right answer. But if I asked you to explain the concept from scratch, that's a completely different challenge. Recognition is easy, recall is effort. And your brain only strengthens what it has to pull out of itself, not what it simply sees. Which leads to a strange paradox. The easier learning feels, the less likely you are to remember it. But the harder it feels, the more powerful the memory becomes. Now here's where things get real. Because most modern learning habits are designed to feel smooth and effortless. Scrolling through summaries, listening to content while half distracted, reading quickly without stopping, highlighting lines that feel important. But none of those require your brain to retrieve information. So the brain politely listens and then politely forgets. And here's the ironic part. Highlighting text might be the most comforting lie in learning. You mark a sentence in bright yellow. Your brain gets a little hit of satisfaction. Good job, you captured that. But capturing information is not the same as storing it. If you've ever highlighted half a book, only to realize you remember almost nothing from it, you're not alone. Actually, try something for a second. Think about the last book you finished. Not the one you're reading right now, the one before that. How much of it could you explain to someone right now? Take a moment. Seriously.
Because this is the moment most people notice something uncomfortable. They remember the idea of the book, the vibe, maybe one or two quotes, but the actual insights? Blurry. Now don't panic. This isn't a failure. It's simply how the brain works when we consume information passively. But here's the part that changes everything. Memory is not built when you read something. Memory is built when you try to remember it later. That attempt, that mental reaching, that small moment of struggle is like a signal to your brain. This matters. And the brain responds by strengthening the pathway. Think of it like walking through grass. The first time you cross it, the grass stands tall again. But if you walk the same path repeatedly, a trail forms. Memory works the same way. Every time you retrieve information from your mind, you deepen the path. But if you never return to it, nature takes over. The trail disappears. Which explains something strange you've probably experienced. Have you ever struggled to remember something, and then suddenly the answer pops into your head hours later? That's your brain continuing the search. Because once you challenge memory, your brain keeps working on it in the background, almost like it hates unfinished puzzles. Now here's a question most people never ask themselves. Why do we immediately check the answer when we forget something? Why not sit with the question for a few seconds longer? Is it impatience, curiosity, or something else? Maybe it's discomfort. Our minds hate the feeling of not knowing, but ironically, that discomfort is exactly where memory grows. And this next idea might sound simple, but it changes the entire way you learn. Instead of asking, "How do I study this?" you start asking, "How will I remember this tomorrow?" Small shift, huge difference. Because the moment you ask that question, you stop being a consumer of information. You become a designer of memory. And this is where the journey starts getting interesting. Because once you understand how recall works, you unlock a technique used by elite learners, memory champions, and top students around the world. A technique so simple, it almost sounds ridiculous. But when people start using it, they remember 2, 3, sometimes 5 times more than before. And the strange part? It doesn't require reading more. It requires reading less. Yes, less. But in a way that forces your brain to wake up. And once you see how it works, you might realize something slightly shocking. You've been learning backwards your entire life. But don't worry. The fix is simpler than you think. And it starts with a tiny habit almost nobody practices anymore. A habit that turns passive knowledge into permanent memory.
Here's the strange habit almost nobody practices anymore. Stopping. Not scrolling. Not reading faster. Not jumping to the next idea. Just stopping. Because the moment you pause after learning something, your brain gets a chance to do something powerful. It tries to reconstruct the idea from memory. And this tiny act changes everything. Imagine you just read a powerful paragraph in a book. Most people immediately move to the next page. But a different kind of learner does something unusual. They close the book for a moment, and they ask themselves a simple question. What did that actually say? Not word for word, just the idea, the meaning. They try to explain it in their own words. At first, it feels awkward. Your mind reaches, but the thought feels incomplete. And that's when the magic happens. Because the brain hates incomplete thoughts. It starts digging, searching, connecting pieces. And suddenly,
the idea reappears, not as a sentence you read, but as something you understand. Now, pause for a moment and think about that. There's a huge difference between repeating words and reconstructing meaning. One is copying, the other is learning. And here's the twist most people never realize. Your brain doesn't store information the way it was presented. It stores the way you processed it. If you read passively, the memory stays weak. But if you rebuild the idea yourself, the brain tags it as yours. That's why teachers who explain things often remember them better than the students listening. They're constantly reconstructing ideas, constantly retrieving, constantly strengthening memory. Which leads to a powerful question. What if learning wasn't about reading more, but about remembering more from what you already read? Think about how different that approach feels. Instead of racing through chapters, you slow down. You interact with the ideas. You test your memory. And suddenly, learning becomes active. But wait until you hear this part, because there's another hidden force shaping your memory every single day. A force most people underestimate. Time. Or, more specifically, spacing. You see, memory doesn't strengthen when information stays in front of you. It strengthens when it leaves your mind, and then you bring it back. That gap between forgetting and remembering, that's where the brain does its deepest work. Scientists call this spaced repetition, but the concept is beautifully simple. Instead of reviewing something once, you revisit it over time. A day later, a few days later, a week later. Each time your brain has to retrieve the idea again, and each time the memory grows stronger. It's like exercising a muscle. One workout doesn't change much, but repeated effort over time, that builds strength. And here's where things get fascinating. The moment something feels slightly harder to remember is exactly when you should review it. Because that slight difficulty, that small resistance, is proof the brain is about to reinforce the pathway. But if you review information too soon, while it still feels easy, the brain doesn't strengthen it. It thinks, we already know this, so it moves on. Which explains something strange. Have you ever reread your notes and felt like everything made sense, but later realized you still couldn't explain it? That's the trap. Rereading feels productive, but it rarely challenges memory. Now let me ask you something. When was the last time you tested yourself on something you learned? Not a formal test, just asking yourself questions, trying to recall the idea without looking. Most people don't do this because it feels uncomfortable. And here's a quiet confession. Even people who love learning avoid the parts that feel difficult. But difficulty is not the enemy. It's the signal. It's the brain saying, this effort matters. Now here's the interesting shift that happens once you understand all this. You stop chasing more information. You start protecting the information you already have. You become more selective, more intentional. You begin asking yourself a question most people never consider. If I remember only 3 things from this, what should they be? And that question alone changes how your brain listens. Because now the mind is searching for meaning, not just absorbing noise. But this is only part of the story. Because even when you understand retrieval, even when you use spacing, here's the silent thief that ruins memory before it even begins. Attention. Not intelligence, not effort, just attention. Because memory doesn't start when you try to remember something later. It starts the moment your brain decides something is worth noticing. And in the world most of us live in today, That decision is getting harder and harder. Think about the last time you tried to focus on something important. Maybe reading a book, learning a skill, listening to a podcast. How long did it take before something interrupted you? A notification, a quick check of your phone, a random thought that sent you searching for something else. Suddenly 20 minutes disappear. And the original idea you were learning? Lost. Now here's the uncomfortable realization. Every time your attention breaks, your brain resets the learning process. It's like trying to build a bridge, but someone keeps removing the first few pieces. You never reach the deeper layers where memory forms, which explains something many people feel but rarely understand. Mental exhaustion, not from working too hard, but from constantly switching attention. Your brain burns energy every time it shifts focus. So when you finally sit down to learn something meaningful, your mind already feels tired. And tired minds don't build strong memories. They skim, they drift, they forget. Now let me ask you something honestly. When you study or read something important, is your phone within reach? Be honest. Because for most people, the answer is yes. And that tiny device quietly splits your attention. Even if you don't touch it, even if it stays silent, your brain knows it's there, which means part of your attention stays on standby, waiting, listening. And attention divided is memory weakened. But this is where the story begins to turn, because the solution isn't extreme discipline, it's awareness. Once you realize attention is the gatekeeper of memory, you start protecting it differently. You create moments of intentional focus, short ones, not hours. Just enough time for the brain to lock onto something meaningful. And something interesting happens. The more you practice focused attention, the easier remembering becomes. Because memory loves clarity, not chaos. Now here's where everything you've learned in this journey comes together. Memory is not about reading more. It's about 3 simple shifts. First, you challenge your brain to recall instead of constantly rereading. Second, you space your learning over time, letting forgetting become part of the process. And third, you protect your attention, because without it, nothing sticks. Simple ideas, but powerful ones. And here's the surprising part. When people start applying these principles, learning begins to feel completely different. Instead of drowning in information, they begin recognizing patterns. Instead of forgetting everything, they remember the ideas that truly matter. And slowly, something deeper changes. They stop doubting their ability to learn, because the problem was never their brain. The problem was the system they were using. Now imagine something for a moment. Imagine 6 months from now. You read a book and still remember the key ideas weeks later. You watch a lecture and can explain it clearly to someone else. You learn new skills and they actually stay with you. That kind of confidence changes the way you approach knowledge. Learning stops feeling overwhelming. It starts feeling empowering. And here's the beautiful part. You don't need a perfect memory to do this. You just need to work with your brain instead of against it. Because your mind was never broken. It was simply misunderstood. And once you understand it, you realize something powerful. The ability to remember isn't a talent. It's a skill anyone can train. Which leads to one final thought worth holding on to. The information you keep in your mind eventually shapes the person you become. The ideas you remember influence your decisions, your habits. Because the difference between information that disappears and knowledge that transforms you is often just one small shift in how you learn. If this perspective resonated with you, don't just scroll away. Subscribe and keep exploring the ideas that help you think clearer, learn deeper, and live a little wiser.